I never imagined that spending my last $20 would be the decision that changed everything. But sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest storms. My hands trembled as I counted the crumpled bills in my apron pocket for the third time that evening. $23. $23 in tips from a grueling double shift at Rosie's Diner, and it still wasn't enough to cover my half of this month's rent. The math was simple and heartbreaking. I needed at least $40 to make it work, and payday wasn't until Friday. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that harsh, unforgiving glow that made even the youngest faces look tired. It was nearly 9 o'clock on a Sunday night, and the usual dinner rush had dwindled to just a handful of stragglers, truck drivers nursing their third cup of coffee, a young couple sharing a piece of apple pie, and the man in the corner booth who'd been sitting there for over 3 hours. I'd been watching him all evening, this weathered stranger who looked like he'd seen too much of the world's rough edges. He was maybe 50, maybe older. It was hard to tell, with the kind of weariness that seemed to radiate from him like heat from asphalt. His clothes were clean but worn thin, the kind of worn that comes from being washed by hand in gas station bathrooms. His boots had seen thousands of miles, and his hands, when he lifted his water glass, shook just slightly. But it was his eyes that got to me. They held the particular emptiness of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to matter. Every 20 minutes or so, I'd make my rounds, refilling water glasses and checking on customers. Each time I approached his table, he'd straighten up slightly, offer a polite nod, and nurse that same glass of water he'd ordered when he first sat down. He never asked for anything else, never complained, just sat there like he was trying to make himself invisible. "Maya, honey, you're gonna wear a hole in those tiles," called Sarah, the other waitress on duty. She was in her 50s, with kind eyes and the sort of maternal instinct that made her perfect for this job. "That man bothering you?" I glanced back at the corner booth, where the stranger was studying the menu for what had to be the dozenth time. "No, I think he's hungry." "Then why doesn't he order something?" That was the question, wasn't it? I'd seen plenty of customers stretch a cup of coffee or a glass of water to make it last, usually because they were counting pennies just like I was. But there was something different about this man, something that made my chest ache every time I looked at him. It was when I was wiping down table 6 that I finally noticed the tattoo on his left forearm. Faded green ink that had blurred slightly with age, but still clear enough to read 1st Infantry Division. Below it, dates that told a story I was only beginning to understand. 2001 to 2004. A veteran. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. This man had served his country, had probably seen things that would give me nightmares for years. And now he was sitting in a diner at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night, making a glass of water last 3 hours because he couldn't afford anything else. I was still staring when he looked up and caught my eye. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he cleared his throat quietly. "Excuse me, miss?" His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much lately. "I was wondering, do you folks need any help around here? Dishes, maybe? Sweeping? I'm not looking for charity, just wondering if there's any work I could do for a meal." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with pride and desperation in equal measure. This man, this soldier, was asking to work for food. The unfairness of it made my throat tight. "Let me check with my manager," I managed to say, though I already knew what Rita would tell me. We were fully staffed. Business was slow, and she wasn't in the habit of hiring people off the street, especially not at closing time. I found Rita in the back, doing paperwork and muttering about food costs. She was a good woman. Rita had given me a job when I desperately needed one, had been patient when I was learning the ropes. But she ran a tight ship, and sentiment didn't pay the bills. "Rita, there's a customer out there, a veteran, and he's asking if he can work for a meal. Maybe wash dishes or..." "Maya." She looked up from her ledger, her expression already apologetic. You know I can't do that. Insurance liability, health department regulations. I can't just let strangers into my kitchen. But he seems nice, and he's clearly what? Hungry? Homeless? Rita's voice softened. Honey, I feel for him. I do. But I've got a business to run. We start taking in every person who needs help, and we'll be out of business in a month. I nodded, understanding her position even as my heart sank. Rita wasn't cruel, she was practical. She had employees to pay, bills to cover, a life to maintain. But as I walked back toward the dining room, I couldn't stop thinking about those dates tattooed on the man's arm. 2001 to 2004. 3 years in Iraq, probably. 3 years of serving his country, and now he was reduced to asking strangers if he could wash dishes for a meal. He was still sitting in the corner booth when I returned, hands folded on the table, waiting patiently for my answer. The hope in his eyes made this so much worse. I'm sorry, I said quietly. We're not hiring right now. He nodded, like he'd expected as much. I understand. Thank you for asking. He started to slide out of the booth. I should probably head out, let you folks close up. Wait. The word came out before I could stop it. What's your name? He paused, halfway to standing. Frank Morrison. I'm Maya. I looked around the diner. Sarah was cleaning tables. Rita was still in the back. The other customers were absorbed in their own conversations. Frank, when's the last time you had a hot meal? The question seemed to surprise him. He sat back down slowly, considering. Been a while, he admitted finally. How long is a while? 3 days, maybe 4. He shrugged, like it didn't matter, but I could see the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders. There's a food bank in Millerville, but they're only open Wednesdays and Saturdays. My hand went instinctively to my apron pocket, to those 23 crumpled dollars that represented 8 hours of work, sore feet, and difficult customers. $23 that I needed for rent, for keeping the tiny apartment I shared with my grandmother above Chen's hardware store. But looking at Frank, really looking at him, I saw something that made the decision for me. Under the weariness, under the careful politeness, there was still dignity. This man wasn't asking for a handout. He'd offered to work, to earn his meal. The fact that circumstances made that impossible wasn't his fault. The meatloaf is good tonight, I heard myself saying. Comes with mashed potatoes and green beans. Apple pie for dessert if you want it. Frank's eyes widened. Miss, I appreciate the thought, but I told you I can't. It's on the house. I was already walking toward the kitchen, my heart pounding. Rita always makes too much on Sundays anyway. It'll just go to waste. It was a lie, and we both knew it. Rita portioned everything precisely, wasted nothing. But Frank didn't argue, and I pretended not to see the way his hands shook as I set the plate in front of him. What happened next is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Frank Morrison, this weathered veteran who'd been invisible to everyone else, looked down at that plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, and tears began rolling down his cheeks. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the quiet, unstoppable kind that come from somewhere deeper than embarrassment or pride. Thank you, he whispered, and those 2 words carried more weight than any speech I'd ever heard. I stood there for a moment, watching him compose himself, and felt something shift inside my chest. This was what kindness looked like when it really mattered. Not the easy kind, dropping change in a donation box or volunteering when it was convenient, but the kind that cost something. The kind that required you to choose someone else's need over your own. Frank ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was the finest meal he'd ever had. Between bites, he told me small things about himself, how he'd grown up in Ohio, served 3 tours overseas, lost his wife to cancer 2 years ago, how the grief and the nightmares had cost him his job, then his apartment, then his hope. Been living in the woods behind the truck stop for about 6 months now, he said quietly. Got a little camp set up, nothing fancy. But it's been hard, you know? Not the sleeping rough, I've done worse. It's the feeling like you don't exist. like you're just taking up space. I refilled his coffee cup, my throat tight. You're not taking up space, Frank. You served your country. You matter. He looked up at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Recognition. Not of me specifically, but of the act itself, of being seen, of being valued, of mattering to another human being. When he finished eating, Frank reached for his wallet, a battered leather thing held together with electrical tape. At least let me leave a tip. Don't you dare. I crossed my arms, trying to look stern. The only payment I want is for you to come back if you need another meal. Promise me that. Frank studied my face for a long moment. Then he pulled out a small notebook and carefully wrote something down. Maya Chen, he said, reading my name tag. I won't forget this. I won't forget you. As he was leaving, Frank paused at the door and turned back. That kindness of yours, it's going to come back to you someday. Maybe not how you expect, but it will. Good things find good people, Maya. Remember that. I watched through the window as he walked across the parking lot. His steps a little steadier, his shoulders a little straighter. Something about him had changed in the space of an hour. Not everything, but something important. He looked less invisible. It wasn't until I was cleaning his table that I saw Rita standing behind me, arms crossed, expression unreadable. That meal came out of tonight's receipts, she said quietly. My stomach dropped. Rita, I can pay for it. I have $23 in tips. She held up a hand when I started to protest. I heard you counting earlier. Maya, that meal cost $15. You just spent 2/3 of your tip money on a stranger. I lifted my chin, trying to look more confident than I felt. He's a veteran. He served his country, and now he's living in the woods. I couldn't just... I know what he is. Rita's voice was softer now, but no less serious. And I know what you are, a 22-year-old girl who's working 2 jobs to take care of her grandmother. A girl who can't afford to give away money she doesn't have. It was my choice. Yes, it was. And now it's mine. Rita walked to the register, punched in some numbers, and pulled out $20. Your tip money. All of it. I stared at the bills in her outstretched hand. Rita, I can't. You can, and you will. That man needed a meal, and you gave it to him. But Maya, her expression grew stern. This can't happen again. I run a business, not a charity. You start giving away free meals to every hard luck story that walks through that door, and we'll both be out of work. Do you understand me? I nodded, taking the money with hands that shook slightly. $20 wouldn't cover my portion of rent, but it was more than I'd had before Frank arrived. Good. Rita turned to go, then paused. For what it's worth, what you did was decent. Just be smarter about it next time. As I finished my closing duties that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Frank's last words. Good things find good people. I hoped he was right. Because looking at my bank account, I was going to need some good things to find me soon. But as I walked home through the quiet streets of our little town, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. For the first time in months, I'd done something that mattered. Something that had nothing to do with paying bills, or meeting obligations, or just getting through another day. I'd reminded another human being that they weren't invisible. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Frank Morrison was about to make a phone call that would change everything. That my simple act of kindness was about to ripple outward in ways I never could have imagined. But that's a story for tomorrow. Tonight, as I climbed the stairs to the apartment I shared with Grandma Rose, I was just a tired waitress who'd given her last $20 to a stranger and somehow felt richer for it. Chapter 2. Rita's Mistake. I never expected that feeding one hungry man would cost me everything. But standing in Rita's office 3 days later, watching her slide my final paycheck across the desk, I learned that sometimes the universe has a cruel sense of timing. This is effective immediately, Rita said, her voice flat and businesslike. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Clean out your locker and turn in your apron." My hands trembled as I stared at the pink slip attached to my paycheck. The official reason, typed in neat letters: violation of company policy regarding unauthorized distribution of food items. But I could read between the lines. I could see it in the way Rita's jaw tightened, in the way she'd been watching me for the past 3 days like I was some kind of threat. "Rita, please," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need this job. My grandmother's medication, the rent." "Should have thought about that before you decided to play Mother Teresa with my inventory." She finally looked at me then, and there was something cold in her eyes that I'd never seen before. "You think I don't notice how customers ask for your section specifically? How they light up when you walk over with that sweet smile of yours?" The accusation hit me like a slap. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the way you make the rest of us look bad, with your little acts of kindness. Your grandmother cookies for the truck drivers. Your extra attention for the lonely customers. Do you think that doesn't affect business? Do you think the other girls don't notice when customers leave bigger tips for you?" I stared at her, understanding dawning with sick clarity. This wasn't about Frank's meal. This was about jealousy. About Rita feeling threatened by something I'd never even realized I was doing. "I was just being nice," I said weakly. "Nice doesn't pay my bills, Maya. And it sure as hell doesn't give you the right to hand out free meals to every sob story that walks through my door." She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor, with a sound like fingernails on chalkboard. "I've been running this diner for 15 years. I know what works and what doesn't. And what doesn't work is employees who think they know better than their boss." 20 minutes later, I stood in the parking lot with my few belongings in a paper bag, my spare apron, a coffee mug Grandma Rose had given me, and a small first aid kit I'd kept in my locker. The autumn air was sharp against my face, or maybe that was just the tears I was trying not to shed. 22 years old, unemployed, with $73 to my name and rent due in 5 days. I spent the rest of that Wednesday morning walking Main Street with my resume in hand, visiting every business that might possibly need help. Chen's hardware store, where Mr. Chen gave me a sympathetic smile, but explained that his nephew had just started working there. Murphy's grocery, where Mrs. Murphy avoided eye contact and claimed they weren't hiring. The pharmacy, the gas station, even the auto parts store where I had no qualifications whatsoever. By lunchtime, I realized what was happening. Word traveled fast in a town of 3,000 people, and apparently Rita had been busy. Every polite rejection felt the same, that slight hesitation, the way eyes wouldn't quite meet mine, the sudden discovery that positions that had been available yesterday were mysteriously filled today. I saved the bank for last, hoping that maybe, just maybe, my 2 years of community college and my clean record would be enough to land me the teller position I'd seen advertised. The bank was where respectable people worked, where a steady paycheck and benefits might finally give Grandma Rose and me some security. Margaret Henley, the branch manager, was a woman I'd known my entire life. She'd been friends with my mother before the accident, had even sent a casserole when Grandma Rose took me in. Surely she would give me a fair chance. "Maya, dear," she said when I explained why I was there. Her voice was kind but distant, like she was talking to a stranger. "I'm afraid we've just filled that position." "The sign is still in the window," I pointed out gently. "Well, yes, we haven't had a chance to take it down yet." Her smile was apologetic but firm. "I'm sure you understand." I did understand. I understood perfectly. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting on the bench outside the post office, staring at my phone and trying to figure out what to do next. Grandma Rose would be expecting me home soon, would want to hear about my day, and I had no idea how to tell her that her granddaughter had managed to destroy their lives over a $15 plate of meatloaf. Her insulin was running low. I had maybe 3 days worth left, and the prescription cost $68 to refill, money I didn't have. Money I wouldn't have even if I found a job today, because no one pays daily in the real world. I thought about Frank, wondered if he was still living in the woods behind the truck stop. At least he had survival skills. What did I have? A high school diploma, 2 years of college I couldn't afford to finish, and a reputation as a troublemaker in a town where everyone knew everyone. The walk home felt longer than usual. Main Street stretched endlessly in front of me, each familiar storefront now a reminder of another door that had closed. The hardware store where I'd learned to count change, the diner where I'd just lost my job, the bank where I'd learned that kindness could be a liability. I was so lost in my misery that I almost didn't notice the motorcycle. It was just a distant rumble at first, the kind of sound you hear on the highway and forget about. But this was different. This was deliberate. The engine noise grew louder, closer, and when I looked up, I saw a single rider turning onto Main Street. The bike was a beautiful machine, a Harley-Davidson with chrome that caught the afternoon sunlight like liquid mercury. The rider wore a leather jacket and moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd been riding for decades. As he passed me, I caught a glimpse of his face under the helmet. It looked like Frank, but that was impossible. Frank didn't have a motorcycle. Frank was living rough, asking to wash dishes for meals. Frank was gone. I hadn't seen him since Sunday night, and I'd assumed he'd moved on to the next town, the next diner, the next act of charity from some other foolish waitress. The motorcycle disappeared around the corner toward the truck stop, and I convinced myself I'd been mistaken. Grief and stress could make you see things that weren't there. I had bigger problems to worry about than phantom bikers. But as I climbed the stairs to the apartment I shared with Grandma Rose above Chen's Hardware, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. The air felt different somehow, charged with possibility or danger, I couldn't tell which. "Maya, is that you, sweetheart?" Grandma Rose's voice called from the kitchen. "Yes, Grandma." I hung my jacket on the hook by the door and tried to compose my face into something that wouldn't worry her. Rose Chen was 76 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and tougher than most people half her age. She'd raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, had worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, had never once complained about the burden of an unexpected granddaughter. Diabetes had slowed her down in recent years, but her mind was sharp and her heart was generous. She took one look at me and knew something was wrong. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to the kitchen table. "I'll make tea." "Grandma, I can." "Sit." The tone brooked no argument. Saturday. She moved around the small kitchen with practiced efficiency, filling the kettle, getting out the good cups, the ones with the delicate blue flowers that had belonged to her mother. When she finally settled across from me, her dark eyes were full of concern. "Tell me," she said simply. So I did. I told her about Rita's accusations, about being fired, about spending the morning being rejected by every business in town. I told her about the insulin running low and the rent due in 5 days, and the growing certainty that I'd ruined everything by trying to do something good. Grandma Rose listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother," she said finally, "once gave her lunch money to a classmate whose family was having hard times. Came home hungry, but proud. When I asked her why, she said, 'Mama, someone needed it more than me.' Tears spilled down my cheeks. But Mom didn't lose her job over it. No, she didn't. But she raised a daughter who would rather go hungry than let someone else suffer. And that daughter is sitting at my table right now, worried about my medicine instead of her own future." Grandma Rose reached across the table and took my hands. "Maya, I've lived 76 years. I've seen people do terrible things for money and wonderful things for love. What you did was wonderful. Wonderful doesn't pay for insulin. No, it doesn't. But it does something else." She squeezed my hands. "It plants seeds. Sometimes we never see them grow, but sometimes." She was interrupted by a sound from outside, another motorcycle engine, then another. Not the single bike I'd seen earlier, but multiple machines, their rumble growing louder as they approached. We looked at each other, puzzled. Our little town wasn't exactly a biker destination. Most motorcycle traffic stayed on the interstate, bypassing us entirely. The sound grew closer, and suddenly the rumble was right outside our window. I got up and peered through the curtains, expecting to see a small group of weekend riders stopping for gas. What I saw instead made my breath catch. The street below was filling with motorcycles, not just a few, but dozens. Harley-Davidsons mostly, ridden by men and women who moved with the kind of purpose that suggested this wasn't a casual ride. They wore leather jackets with patches I couldn't read from this distance, and they were all heading in the same direction, toward the truck stop, toward the diner. "Grandma," I said, my voice strange in my own ears, "I think you should see this." She joined me at the window, and together we watched as what looked like an entire motorcycle club descended on our quiet town. The riders moved with discipline, parking in formation, dismounting with synchronized precision. "Well," Grandma Rose said after a moment, "that's something you don't see every day." As we watched, more bikes arrived. I lost count after 30, but they kept coming. The rumble of engines filled the air, and I could see people coming out of their houses and businesses to stare. In a town where the biggest excitement was usually the Friday night football game, this was unprecedented. And then, I saw him. Frank Morrison walked out from behind the diner, no longer the broken man I'd served 3 days ago. He stood tall, his shoulders straight, his bearing unmistakably military. As he approached the gathering bikers, several of them embraced him like brothers, welcoming home a lost family member. "Oh my," Grandma Rose breathed. "I think your seeds just started growing." My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, my former coworker. "Maya, you need to get down here. These bikers are asking about you." Rita's freaking out. Another text followed immediately. "They say they want to talk to the girl who fed Frank. What did you do?" I stared at the messages, my heart hammering. Below us, the crowd of motorcycles had grown to what looked like 40 or 50 bikes. The riders were gathering near the diner, and even from this distance, I could see Rita standing in the doorway, her face pale. "Grandma," I said slowly, "I think I need to go down there." "Yes," she agreed, her eyes bright with something that might have been pride or excitement. "I think you do. But Maya?" She caught my arm as I headed for the door. "Remember what your mother used to say. Kindness always comes home, but it doesn't always knock first." As I made my way down the stairs and onto Main Street, the sound of 40 motorcycle engines filled the air like thunder. Whatever was about to happen, whatever Frank had set in motion with that phone call 3 days ago, I was about to find out if kindness really did find its way home. The question was, would it be the salvation I desperately needed, or had I just stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than feeding one hungry veteran? Only one way to find out. Chapter 3. Brothers on Main Street. I never expected that collecting my final paycheck would lead to the most shocking offer of my life. But walking onto Main Street that Thursday morning and seeing 40 motorcycles lined up like chrome soldiers, I realized my world was about to change in ways I couldn't possibly imagine. The sight stopped me dead in my tracks. Every parking space from the bank to the post office was filled with gleaming Harley-Davidsons, their chrome catching the early morning sun like scattered diamonds. The bikes sat in perfect formation, as disciplined as the military men who rode them. I'd never seen anything like it in our quiet town. It was as if an army had descended overnight. My hands shook as I approached the diner. Through the large front windows, I could see every table and booth occupied by people in leather jackets. Not the stereotypical rough bikers you see in movies, but men and women who carried themselves with dignity and purpose. Some were graying, others younger, but they all shared something of bearing that spoke of service, of brotherhood, of people who'd seen the world's darker corners and chose to stand together against them. Rita stood behind the counter, her face pale as chalk, a coffee pot frozen in her trembling hand. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked small, powerless. The woman who'd fired me yesterday with such cold efficiency now appeared to be struggling just to breathe. That's when I saw him. The largest man I'd ever encountered was sitting at the center table, commanding the room simply by existing. He had to be 6'6", with shoulders that strained the seams of his leather jacket. His beard was streaked with silver, his arms covered in tattoos that told stories of places I'd never been. But it was his eyes that held me intelligent, calm, and completely focused on the conversation he was having with the man beside him. Frank. But this wasn't the broken veteran I'd fed 3 days ago. This Frank sat straight, clean-shaven, wearing a leather vest covered in patches that marked him as family among these people. There was life in his eyes again, purpose in his posture. The transformation was so complete it took my breath away. I stood frozen in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter or flee. When the giant man looked up and saw me, his face broke into a smile that transformed his intimidating presence into something warm and welcoming. "You must be Maya," he said, his voice a deep rumble that carried across the suddenly quiet diner. "Frank's told us a lot about you." Every head in the place turned toward me. 40 pairs of eyes, ranging from curious to grateful to something that looked like respect. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and confusion. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I just came to pick up my final paycheck. I didn't mean to interrupt." "Interrupt?" The big man stood, and I had to crane my neck to look at him. "Young lady, you're the reason we're all here. The name's Bear Marcus Williams, but everyone calls me Bear. I'm the president of the Warrior Brotherhood." He gestured around the room. "And every person in this diner owes you a debt of gratitude." I looked around, bewildered. "I don't understand." Frank stood then, approaching me with that new confidence I barely recognized. "Maya, these are my brothers, my family, the unit I served with in Afghanistan, and the motorcycle club we formed when we got back." His voice was steady, clear, nothing like the broken whisper I remembered. "I told them what you did for me, what it meant." "It was just a meal," I said weakly. "No," Bear's voice cut through the air with gentle authority. "It wasn't just a meal. Frank here has been lost for months. We've been trying to reach him, trying to help, but he disappeared on us. Too proud to ask for help, too broken to believe he deserved it." He looked at Frank with obvious affection. "Then he calls me Sunday night, tells me about a young woman who saw him when everyone else looked away, who treated him like he mattered." I glanced at Rita, who was still standing behind the counter like a statue. Her eyes darted between Bear and me, and I could see the calculations running behind them, the realization that this situation was far beyond her control. "We take care of our own," Bear continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the diner. "That's the code we live by. You take care of our brother. That makes you family, and we take care of family." A woman at one of the corner tables stood up. She was maybe 50, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. "Maya, my name is Susan Rodriguez. My husband Miguel served with Frank. We heard what happened to you yesterday, how you lost your job for showing kindness to a veteran." My stomach dropped. How did they know about that? As if reading my thoughts, Bear smiled grimly. "Small towns, small networks. Word travels fast when someone's been wronged, especially when that someone went out of their way to help one of ours." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "Maya Chen, the Warrior Brotherhood, would like to make you an offer." I stared at the envelope like it might bite me. What kind of offer? "The kind that solves all your problems and gives you a chance to solve other people's problems too." Bear's smile widened. "We've purchased Rosie's diner, all of it. Building, equipment, business license, everything." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked at Rita, whose face had gone from pale to gray. "You, what?" "Bought it outright, as of 9 o'clock this morning," Bear confirmed. previous owner was eager to sell once we explained our interest in maintaining local employment opportunities. His tone was pleasant, but there was steel underneath it. "We'd like you to run it." The envelope in his hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "I can't possibly afford." "You're not buying it," Frank said, stepping closer. "You're managing it. Full ownership will transfer to you after 2 years of successful operation, assuming you want it. Until then, you'll draw a manager's salary of $60,000 a year, plus benefits that include full medical coverage for you and any dependents." My knees went weak. $60,000 was more than I'd made in the last 3 years combined. "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" "Because," said a gravelly voice from near the window, "you fed our brother when he was hungry. You saw his worth when everyone else saw his problems. That kind of character is rare, and it deserves to be rewarded." The man who spoke was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and scars on his hands that spoke of hard work and harder times. "I'm Tommy Morrison, no relation to Frank, just happened to share a name. Served 2 tours in Iraq before I got too old for that nonsense. Now I run a construction company back in Missouri." He gestured around the room. "Every person in this diner has a story like Frank's. We've all been lost, forgotten, written off at one point or another, and we've all been saved by someone who decided we were worth saving." A younger man, maybe 30, raised his hand slightly. "I'm Jake Peterson, served with Frank in Kandahar. When I got back, I couldn't hold a job, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. These guys pulled me out of a bottle and helped me start a motorcycle repair shop. Now I employ 6 people and sponsor a youth program for at-risk kids." One by one, they began sharing their stories. Combat veterans who'd found purpose in community. Men and women who'd transformed their pain into service, their brotherhood into a force for good. The Warrior Brotherhood wasn't just a motorcycle club. It was a family built on shared sacrifice and mutual support. "We believe in paying it forward," Bear explained. "Frank was lost, and you found him. Now we want to make sure you never have to worry about feeding anyone who comes to you hungry. This diner will be a place where people matter, where kindness is rewarded, not punished." I looked around the room, at these 40 strangers who'd become family, at Frank, whose transformation still seemed like a miracle, at Rita, who stood behind the counter like her world was ending. "What about Rita?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Bear's expression softened slightly. "Miss Henderson will receive a generous severance package and excellent references for any future employment she might seek. We hold no ill will toward her. We simply believe the diner will be better served under different management." Rita finally found her voice. "You can't just. I built this place. 15 years of my life." "And you built it well," Bear acknowledged respectfully. "But you also built a culture where kindness was discouraged and good people were punished for doing the right thing. That's not the kind of establishment we want to support." He turned back to me, holding out the envelope. "Maya, this is your choice. You can walk away right now, take your final paycheck, and we'll never bother you again. Or you can take this envelope and become part of something bigger than yourself." My hands trembled as I reached for the envelope. Inside were documents I barely understood: ownership papers, insurance policies, bank account information. But at the bottom was something that made my eyes fill with tears. A check made out to Maya Chen, personal use for $5,000. "That's to cover your grandmother's medication and any other immediate needs," Frank said gently. "Consider it a signing bonus." I looked up at him, this man I'd fed 3 days ago, who'd somehow orchestrated a miracle. "Frank, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he smiled. "Say you'll run this place the way it should be run. Say you'll make sure no one leaves here hungry if they can't afford to pay. Say you'll hire people who understand that serving others is an honor, not a burden." The weight of 40 expectant gazes pressed down on me. These people had traveled from 3 states away because I'd bought a stranger a meal. They'd purchased an entire business to make sure kindness would be rewarded instead of punished. It was overwhelming, impossible, and absolutely real. "Yes," I whispered, then louder. "Yes, I accept." The cheer that went up from 40 battle-hardened veterans would have awakened the entire town if most of it wasn't already gathered outside, watching through the windows in amazement. Bear clapped me on the shoulder with a hand that could probably crush concrete. "Welcome to the family, Maya. Welcome to the brotherhood." Over the next hour, as the bikers prepared to leave, each one made a point of speaking with me. They shared business cards, phone numbers, promises of support. Miguel Rodriguez owned a restaurant supply company and would ensure we always had the best ingredients at wholesale prices. Tommy Morrison's construction crew would handle any renovations or maintenance for free. Jake Peterson would service any equipment that broke down. But it was Susan Rodriguez who pulled me aside with the most important information. "Maya," she said quietly, "this isn't charity. This is investment in you, in this community, in the idea that good people deserve good things. You've proven your character. Now you get to prove your capabilities." "What if I fail?" I asked, the magnitude of the responsibility finally hitting me. "Then you fail, surrounded by people who believe in you and will help you succeed the next time." She smiled warmly. "But honey, I've been watching you for the past hour. You're not going to fail." As the Brotherhood prepared to mount their bikes, Frank approached me one last time. The change in him was still miraculous, from a broken man asking to wash dishes to someone who commanded respect and radiated quiet confidence. "Maya," he said, "I want you to understand something. What you did for me wasn't just about food. It was about dignity. About being seen as human when I'd forgotten I was worth seeing." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life that night. Not dramatically, not obviously, but completely. And now we get to save yours." "My life didn't need saving," I protested. "Didn't it?" He smiled sadly. "You were working yourself to death trying to take care of your grandmother. You were one medical emergency away from losing everything. You were so busy taking care of everyone else that nobody was taking care of you." He gestured toward the diner, toward the envelope in my hands. "Now you have a family that will always take care of you, just like you took care of me." Bear's voice boomed across the diner. "Mount up. We've got miles to cover before dark." One by one, the engines roared to life. 40 motorcycles, 40 people who'd become family, 40 reminders that kindness creates ripples that travel farther than we ever imagine. Frank was the last to leave. He straddled his bike, a beautiful machine that gleamed with care and pride, and looked back at me through the window. "Remember, Maya," he called over the rumble of his engine, "the Brotherhood takes care of its own, and you're one of us now." I watched them disappear down Main Street, their engines fading until the town returned to its usual quiet. But everything had changed. I was no longer Maya Chen, unemployed waitress. I was Maya Chen, business owner, manager of Rosie's Diner, member of a family I never knew I needed. Rita approached me as I stood in the doorway, her face a mixture of defeat and grudging respect. "I suppose you'll be wanting me to train you on the books," she said quietly. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not an enemy, but a woman who'd let fear and jealousy drive her to make cruel choices. "Rita, I'd appreciate any help you're willing to give. This place, it should be somewhere people want to work, not somewhere they're afraid to show kindness." Something shifted in her expression. Not friendship, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. That night, as I sat with Grandma Rose and told her everything that had happened, she listened with the same calm attention she'd shown me my entire life. "Your mother would be proud," she said finally. "She always believed that love comes back to you, but sometimes it takes the long way home." Looking out our window at the diner that was now mine, At the town that had watched 40 angels in leather transform everything in a single morning, I understood what she meant. My $20 act of kindness had indeed taken the long way home. But when it arrived, it brought with it a family, a future, and the profound realization that sometimes the most unlikely people become our salvation. Frank was right, the brotherhood takes care of its own. And somehow, miraculously, I was one of them now.